my cousins will say, well, this is kind of more money than I thought. He goes, yeah, it's more money than you thought. Oh, it's more money than you thought. You can say it's for school. I'm giving you this for school. So he did things like that all the time with all of us. So he was a quiet and unassuming man. He did not have what we would call a public face where everybody could just recognize him. He didn't have any of those qualities. What he did was always kind of underground, kind of invisible, and when he died, there was tons of stories about how he was there for other people. Tons of little tiny stories. Like my cousin told me, not just my cousin, my aunt, told me that when she was going to school in high school and community college here in San Luis Obispo, my father every week would tap on her door, or window at their house, the house across the street, and give her and her sister 50 cents. Each got 50 cents, and that was their allowance for the week. But he did that for lots of different people and did things like that all the time. But those are the kind of stories that came up. But he's quiet and unassuming, and he just realized what his commitments were to his family, and he played that out. So any questions, thoughts, ideas, concepts, overviews? Yes?
I have a question about the whole sign of respect and culture of calling someone and not being related to them. Is that kind of the same principle as sir or ma'am here?
Yeah.
Or is it held higher?
No, it's not. Sir and ma'am are signs of respect too, right? The same thing, but aunt and uncle are like family, right? It holds that connection. It's family. You know, my father was came from a generation of the older men who were working in the fields who didn't get married, were called Manomes. And I grew up with a lot of Manomes, and that's what I called them. I didn't necessarily know their names, but I could say Manome, and they would respond. So it's kind of a sign of collectiveness. Any other questions? Yes.
How is it that your father became a farmer here in Oregon, and how was he able to get land? Like his own?
Oh, okay. How he came here, I don't know if he ever told me, but I know that he ended up in Guadalupe. He worked for this Watson farm, which did herbs. They grew herbs in Guadalupe. And I don't know if that's where they routed people. They said, here's where all the farming is. And they moved to Oregon. And they wanted my father to go with them, but he really wanted to stay with his family, which are all these Betita clan. They were all here. He was, I'll have to add this, he was a seasonal migrant worker. He followed the season up to, I think he told me up to, I want to say Delano, Fresno. He followed that whole route and then back on the coast. So he did that, I think for 2 or 3 years before he really settled to this one company. How he got land here in Arroyo Grande was homesteading. That was one way you got land here. Arroyo Grande was actually dying as a community, and it's a farming community originally, and it was dying because people were not farming and people were moving to places where they could make money. So if you wanted to farm, if you were willing to farm, you could homestead property here. And a lot of Asians did it, a lot of Filipinos did it, a lot of Japanese Americans did it also, got to homestead. The other part was when World War II occurred, a lot of the Japanese farmers in this area either pledged loyalty to the U.S. government, which meant they could stay on their property, or they got sent to the concentration camps. Right here was it closest as Manzanar. So what they did was they asked the Filipinos to farm their land for them. And so when the war ended, sometimes Filipinos got land that were given to them by the Japanese farmers. So that's how they got also land in that same way. So there's 2 ways you could get land here at that time.
I'm curious to know how much of
question. In the newer generations, it's become more, in my family, there's a lot of interracial marriages and biracial kids. So there's kind of a fading out, but also sometimes bringing things in. So when we have gatherings, they're big Filipino, and then sometimes what happens is we start speaking Filipino. We do phrases and concepts, and then, I'm good at imitating my mother who's sitting in the back. I talk like her. So I can do that. So sometimes we do that. So sometimes it gets lost. One of the things we always talk about, and I'm always aware of, is the concept of internalized racism, how it's not okay to be the race you are. So you try to blend in as much as possible to be what the majority is, so you give up what is there because it's easier to be whatever was approved of in the larger world. I do know there was a research done on Latinos, that the first and second generation born here, Latinos, the first generation would lose their language, would keep their language, the second generation would lose it, and then by the time it got to the third and fourth, and maybe the fifth generation, they would come back to it. They wanted to know what their identity was like. So there's sometimes a movement away, then a movement back. So, okay, that's a good question, because I don't know what happens. I cook Filipino food to keep it going, and I feed my friends. Yeah, it is good food, huh? I think so too. Cook it all the time. And the Filipino language, we have this concept, and this is kind of a stereotyping, but you know you're Filipino because you have bago. You know what that is? Lunch. You bring your lunch. You bring your Filipino food instead of sandwiches. Right? You have bago. That's how you know you're Filipino, because you bring your lunch. Your Filipino lunch. Okay, any other questions? Any other questions, thoughts, ideas? Oh, one more. Yes, two more.
Does the family farm still exist?
The farm exists. It's not as big as it had been in the past, but we still, other people farm it. But Kawaguchi Brothers, I always like to advertise them. They're what I call agribusiness, because they took in all the small farms and rent them, and they farm. They farm everybody else's property, and that's what they do. They're like in the